Our New England ancestors were canny enough that they weren't going to sign up for lands that they hadn't had a good report of. So they sent their committee. And I want to quote from an article by the Reverend Jacob Whitman Cox in his sketch of the Congregational Church of Cornwallis. He wrote about the committee landing over at Stars Point. He says, the country was in its best dress. The diked meadows of Grand Pre and Canard were all dressed in living green, and the Acadian orchards and gardens were glorious, with apple and cherry and plum trees in full array of blossoms. The committee were charmed with the prospects. Well, a year later, on June the 4th, 1780, hundreds of 1760, sorry. Maybe if I move that a little bit, it won't be between me and the manuscript. In 1760, hundreds of New England planters arrived from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And I often think about what they must have thought, getting off those 22 ships at Norton Landing and Stars Point. We know that they couldn't have come into this province at a better time of year. The report that went back to Connecticut with the vessels was that they liked the lands far better than expected. That's good. Now, you folks are gathered here because you're connected one way or another with the Cogswell family. The ancestor of the Kings County Cogswells was Hezekiah Cogswell. He was born in Connecticut in 1709. How many of you, just show of hands, are descended from Hezekiah? Oh yeah, really? Good number. Thank you. If I've counted correctly, he's the 5th generation from John Cogswell, who came from England to Ipswich, Mass. in 1635. Now, you can feel good about the fact that the Cogswells are among the founding English-speaking settlers of 2 countries, what are today the United States and Canada. The information that is recorded in that big red book, that Cogswell genealogy, tells that John and Elizabeth Cogswell and their 8 children came from Westbury in southwestern England to Ipswich, Massachusetts on the ship the Angel Gabriel in 1635. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you folks about the storm and the shipwreck. That's gotta be family lore that's passed to every child because it's a wonderful story. They had a rough time, but they all survived, and that's the best part of it. They seem to have lived for a generation or so in Ipswich, Massachusetts, before relocating to Connecticut. First to Saybrook, and then some of them to Canterbury, and finally to Lebanon, Connecticut, before they decided to take up the offer of land grants in Nova Scotia and became New England planters. Now let me tell you a little bit about the New England planters in Nova Scotia. What is a planter? Well, first let me tell you what it's not. It's not a loyalist or Tory. The American Revolution was still over 15 years in the future. The Boston Tea Party hadn't happened. Concord and Lexington were just 2 little towns west Boston. The word planter in this sense doesn't have anything to do with agriculture either, although many of them were farmers. Planter is an Old English word which means colonist. Planters planted colonies for Great Britain. And the word was applied to this group much later by historians who were looking for a name for this significant group of people, which would distinguish them from the Halifax merchants who came 10 years or so earlier, and the loyalists who came 15 to 20 years later. Now, we've all heard about the 13 colonies at the time of the American Revolution. Actually, England had 16 colonies in North America. There were the 13 that would become rebellious colonies. And there was Quebec and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And the colony of Nova Scotia made up what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. So it was a good sized chunk of land. This is the land of the Mi'kmaq, Glooscaps people. The French were the first Europeans to settle here, and they called this land Acadie. They were and are Acadians. And their descendants in Louisiana are called the Cajuns. Yeah. In addition to the Acadian farmers and fisherfolk, the French had built a fortress at Louisbourg in Cape Breton, and there's a marvelous recreation of that if you are heading that direction. Louisbourg was a convenient location for the French because it's far enough out in the Atlantic that it gave the French warships a wonderful port from which to disrupt navigation between London and Boston. France and Britain had been at war for a good part of the century, and this was a major threat to both England and New England. The tensions culminated in 1755 with the infamous expulsion of the Acadians, which was chronicled in Longfellow's poem Evangeline. Now, less than half of the Acadians were actually rounded up and deported. It was awful. It was a dreadful chapter in our history. Others, though, were forced to leave their fertile dikes and farmlands and retreat to less fertile areas, like the French shore in Yarmouth County, and northwestern Cape Breton, and northern New Brunswick. Within a very few years, though, it became obvious to the British officials in Halifax and in London, and perhaps most of all in Boston, that if England was going to keep Nova Scotia as a colony, and that was considered vital to the security of New England and New York, it would have to be settled by English-speaking people. And it was agreed that settlers should be sought not from England, where there was an industrial revolution going on and they didn't want to lose the workforce, but from New England, where the climate and conditions were similar and where there was a shortage of good land for the growing population. Now, a common literary form in the 1700s was the tract. There were political tracts and there were lots of religious tracts, but there were also documents known as colonization tracts. And these were little pamphlets encouraging emigration and settlement in various parts of the empire. Nova Scotia was not neglected in this literary genre. Some of the offerings, however, were, let's say, less than encouraging. It's probably a wonder that Nova Scotia isn't still an unpopulated wilderness. Let me read to you from this tract entitled A True Account of the Colonies of Nova Scotia and Georgia, 1774. Why they would be doing Nova Scotia and Georgia. Anyway, this is the Nova Scotia bit. The climate of this country, though within the temperate zone, has been found rather unfavorable to European constitutions. They are wrapped up in the gloom of fog during the greatest part of the year. The fogs come off the sea and sometimes in an instant envelop every object in obscure darkness. From such an unfavorable climate, little can be expected. Nova Scotia is almost a continued forest, and agriculture, though attempted by the English settlers, has hitherto made little progress. In most parts, the soil is thin and barren, and the grass intermixed with cold, spongy moss. My theory is that they landed at Halifax in April. Obviously, the author of that tract was more interested in finding colonists for Georgia than Nova Scotia. The New England planters must have had more promising accounts than they did, because they applied to come in sufficient numbers. Close to 2,500 families, comprising over 8,000 individuals, made their ways from southern New England to Nova Scotia during the 15 years between 1760 and the beginning of the American Revolution in 1775. The settlement process was begun by Governor Charles Lawrence in October 1758. He issued a proclamation which was published in the Boston newspapers. This document stated simply that lands in the province of Nova Scotia had been vacated by the English military victories, and the government would respond favorably to proposals to repopulate the area. This description of Nova Scotia, which accompanied the proclamation, differed significantly from the one in the colonization tract. It said the lands were consisting of upwards of 100,000 acres of interval plough lands, which had been cultivated for more than 100 years past and never fail of crops, nor need manuring. Also, more than 100,000 acres of upland, cleared and stocked with English grass, planted with orchards, gardens, etc. The wild and unimproved lands adjoining to the above are well timbered and wooded. All these lands are so intermixed that every single farmer may have a proportionate quantity of ploughland, grassland, and woodland, and all are situated about the Bay of Fundy upon rivers navigable for ships of burden. Some of that may have been exaggerated a bit in the other way. This offer generated a good deal of interest among residents of the colonies to the south, but the New Englanders wanted more information, specifically about details such as the size and the terms of the grants, taxation. Americans don't like to be taxed, anybody know that? The method of government, religious freedom, and the courts and justice system. In January of 1759, Governor Lawrence issued a second proclamation to answer those questions. And within a few months, associations were formed in many New England towns, and agents were sent to Nova Scotia to have a look at the lands and make proposals for settlement. The selection of agents was interesting. Now, presumably these would be men, yeah, they were all men, it was a man's world. Presumably they were men who had some standing in their community and a fair degree of local trust. That would make sense. They negotiated the terms for the settlement and then returned to their communities to sign up families who wanted to take up grants of land in Nova Scotia. One of the agents from the Lebanon area where Hezekiah Cogswell and his family were living, one of the agents who recruited for Norton and Cornwallis and Falmouth townships was named Amos Fuller. He was an interesting choice because he'd spent time in jail in both Connecticut and New York. He was a counterfeiter. His specialty was 3-pound Rhode Island notes. If you're going to pass fake money, don't pass local money, pass money from the next place over. He may be the only planter that we have a physical description of. You know, a male about 5.5 feet tall, fair complexion, light hair, when last seen wearing a gray homespun jockey coat with brass buttons. He and several others had broken out of jail in New York, and there was a wanted notice posted in the New York Gazette in 1747. The people of Lebanon evidently didn't hold it against him because he was one of the top recruiters, with about 60 families coming to take up lands in Nova Scotia from Lebanon, Connecticut. Go figure. Among the conditions that were negotiated by the agents for the agricultural townships was free transportation to Nova Scotia for the grantees and for their families, and up to 2,000 pounds of stocked provisions and equipment for each individual.
Wow.
For Horton and Cornwallis townships, this took the form of British troop transport ships, which took on passengers at New London, Connecticut. Google Maps suggests that by the old Colchester Road, it's about 25.5 miles from Lebanon to New London, and that today you might drive it in 45 minutes. Those 60 families from Lebanon would have made quite a caravan, and they would have been joined on the way by others from Colchester and Montville and Norwich and other towns. But the travel wouldn't have been easy. In the history of New London, Connecticut, I found this information. The first road between New London and Norwich was laid out in the year 1670, but for more than a century it was little better than an Indian trail. So just picture Hezekiah and Susanna with 6 of their children, most of them in their teens, making their way, possibly with oxen, the 25 miles south to New London, with their allotted 8 tons of baggage. Don't even think about what Air Canada would do with that. Aside from the 2,000 pounds of cargo that was transported to Nova Scotia by each settler, supplies and provisions were procured in various ways. The government in Halifax offered help the first couple winters in form of potatoes and other vegetables. Early Kings County settlers from Connecticut had apparently arranged before they left that goods would be sent to them before the winter set in. Amos Bill was a grantee over in Cornwallis. Billtown was named for his family. He had evidently stayed behind in Connecticut to organize a shipment, because he placed an advertisement in the New London newspaper on the 17th of October 1760. This is to give notice to all persons who are employed to send provisions to the inhabitants of Horton, Cornwallis, or Falmouth in Nova Scotia, that I have procured Mr. Christopher Reed's storehouse in Norwich Landing to put provisions in, that it may put on board the sloop when she arrives. Well, planning ahead. Good stuff. Who were these New England planters? Why did they leave their homes and communities in southern New England to make a new life in this land of fog and spongy moss?
Yeah.
Well, if there were 2,500 families, I'm sure there were 2,500 different stories. But I'll try to give you some general information. The planters were farmers from eastern Connecticut and western Rhode Island. They were tradespeople from Providence and Newport, Boston, and Essex County, Massachusetts. They were fishermen from Cape Cod and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. Those who study migration, the movements of people, use a push-pull model. Factors in the home community that encourage folks to move along, and perceived advantages to making the move. You see, every coin has 2 sides. Many of the planters came because they saw a chance to better themselves. Free grants of land were being offered, 500 acres at a pop. In many areas of New England, several generations of residents had resulted in farms being split too many times between too many sons. The average family had 12 or 15 kids. If half of those were sons, and if even half of those wanted to be farmers, what happens to your farm over 3 generations? You've got little tiny garden spots. 500 acres plus was a wonderful dream. Some came because there was a recession happening in New England just then. And there'd been a major wharf fire in Boston the year before. There were business people who were opting for a new start. There was an established import and trading firm in Newburyport, Massachusetts, Hazen, Simmons, and White. And they set up a branch operation in Conway, that's now St. John, New Brunswick. There were also a few who came to escape creditors. The first few years, Nova Scotia was legally a debtor's haven. New Englanders who were owed money could not come to Nova Scotia to try to collect. That didn't last long, but it lasted a few years. And probably a few others who came to escape the law. Almost 85 families came from the Lebanon, Connecticut area, not Lebanon itself, but that general area. And I've seen an account book for the general store in Lebanon, which included accounts for the year 1760. I've held it in my hands. There were several of those accounts that belonged to folks that I knew had come to Nova Scotia, who had never settled their accounts. It made me feel really good to see that Ivan's ancestor, Noah Fuller, had paid his account in full the end of May of that year. We didn't know anything. I can't remember. I didn't write down about the Cogswells. An in-depth study of who the planters were and where they came from suggests several trends. While the New Englanders who came to Nova Scotia represented a cross-section of the population, some groups were more numerous than others. There were relatively few university-educated professionals, 19 in all, and 9 of those were clergymen. And those who had been community leaders or officials in New England were almost non-existent. But they came with a variety of resources and skills. There were a few who were surveyors, and every township needed a surveyor. That was real important for them. Some were tradesmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, millers, and tailors. Most identified themselves as yeomen, farmers, or fishermen. Surprisingly, to me, they were not predominantly young families. Many of the grantees were men in their 40s, 50s, or even 60s. Hezekiah Cogswell was 51 years old in 1760. He left his whole family by his first wife behind him in Connecticut and brought, I think I figured 3 sons and 2 daughters, or 4 sons and 2 daughters with him. Many of them came though in extended family groups. And in some cases that's obvious. Hezekiah was the only Cogswell that came, and I don't think Susanna Bailey, who was his wife, had relatives, although there certainly were Baileys in planter lists. But in a lot of cases, the relationships were female. Like there might be 3 sisters and their husbands and children that you wouldn't connect unless you dug into the genealogy and figured out who they were. And if planters weren't connected by family, they were connected by community. Almost nobody came solo. They came in groups out of communities in southern New England, 10 or a dozen, or in the case of Lebanon, 60 or 70.